Welcome back to Make Stuff Nation. Today we're working on the mast for my wooden Snipe class sailboat project. The Snipe class rules say that the mast can be made out of either wood or aluminum. For classic or heritage Snipes, most of them have wooden masts because that was the material available at the time. On modern racing Snipes, they use aluminum for weight savings as well as for high performance rigging. One of my fans online, AJ LaPlante, sent me copies of these plans drawn up by T.A. Wells. These are for a round wooden mast for a classic Snipe, and include features for internal halyards for both the jib and mainsail, which is really awesome. To construct this mast, I'm going to need two blanks, one for the port and one for the starboard, that are approximately 21 feet long and about 2 5/8 by 1 3/4 of an inch. To make those blanks, I'm going to use leftover cypress from the framing of the boat and scarf those together to get the required length and then layer them up to get the rest of the required dimensions. Once I have the two blanks made, we'll route out the internal features of the mast and then glue the two blanks together to get the final mast. After that glue is cured, we'll shape the mast round. So building a 21-foot long mast in a 23-foot long shop is a bit of an exercise in space management. So what I decided to do was to build these temporary benches to make the project easier. I used some leftover 2x3 stock from the boat jig to build the benches, and I set it up so I could set my planer in the middle, which really helped in milling down all the rough lumber. Each mast blank is made of 2 layers of cypress, and each layer is made of 3 blanks. I used a homemade jig and a router to cut these scarf joints on each blank, and they're working out pretty well. This is the first mast blank, all glued, cured, and then cleaned up. I'm using Totalboat 5:1 epoxy with the slow hardener, and that's working great for making these mast laminations. Totalboat was nice enough to send me some free epoxy. I'm very grateful for that. I've been using Totalboat products for a couple years, and just very grateful for them helping me out with this project, and I can't recommend them enough. The plastic sheeting on these benches helps prevent the mast blanks from getting epoxied down to the bench, and it makes cleanup a lot easier. So I'm going to go ahead and start gluing up this second mast blank. We'll mix up some Totalboat 5:1 epoxy, and then we'll laminate these layers together. I'm going to use most of my clamps to clamp the layers together, and then I'll have several clamps clamping it down to the bench, and we'll align everything with the edge of the bench, and that'll make sure we keep the mast straight in both the horizontal and vertical directions. I've got most of my clamps pre-positioned and ready to go. Now it's time to mix up the epoxy and get things moving. Now for these scarf joints, I've got some blocks here with plastic wrap over them to cover that feather edge and apply even clamping pressure so that we get a nice, perfect scarf joint. All right, today is tomorrow and the epoxy is completely cured, so now it's time to get rid of all these clamps and clean up the blank to remove all the squeeze out of the epoxy. Well, that's one side cleaned up. Now it's time to flip it over and clean up the other side. Here are both mast blanks all cleaned up. So when these are glued together, they're going to form a solid spar like this. Now obviously these are just roughed out. We still have a lot of work to do. Our next step is going to be to route out all the internal cavities for the halyards for the jib and the mainsail. We'll also cut out an internal channel for the bolt rope on the sail, as well as spots for the sheave blocks or pulleys for the halyards. Once we get those all done, these will be mirror image of each other, so we'll then glue them together to make the final spar. I've completed all the internal work for these two mast blanks. I've routed out a channel for the halyards, for the mainsail and for the jib, as well as a luff groove for the bolt rope on the mainsail. Up here you can see a groove routed out for a metal strap where the jib stay will attach, as well as an area where the sheave will be for where the jib halyard exits the mast. At the base of the mast, you can see the channel for the halyards comes down to the bottom and then exits through an area where there will be two sheaves, one for the mainsail halyard and one for the jib halyard. This groove routed out is where you'll feed the bolt rope of the sail into the luff groove, as well as the sliding gooseneck. At the top of the mast, you can see where the luff groove comes up to the top, as well as the channel for the main halyard. There's also an area for a sheave for where the main halyard exits the top of the mast. Now this blank was cut long, so now we'll trim the blank down to the official mast height. Additionally, the mast tapers from where the forestay attaches up to the top of the mast. So we're going to need to cut this taper also. I've completed roughing in the tapers on the mast. The tapers begin here just where the forestay and side stays attach and proceed up to the top of the mast. The forward face of the mast as well the two sides are tapered. The aft face of the mast is straight all the way from the step to the top. I've just got a few more things to do before I glue the mast blanks together. One thing I've already done is check the fit of these sheaves for the internal halyards. I've checked that I'll be able to slide them in place after I glue the mast together, and it looks like I've got just enough clearance. I also need to make the attachment point for the forestay, which goes right here. So I'm going to use this piece of aluminum and cut it to shape to fit. It's already a nice fit in the slot that I've routed out, but I need to cut the angle on this side so it doesn't interfere with the internal channel for the mainsail halyard. I also need to cut the metal to length and then shape the end and drill the attachment hole for that forestay. All right, that's a good fit. Now we need to mark this hole for the attachment bolt. I think the best way to do that is going to be using a punch from the other side. I will have this protrude a little bit into the channel, but again, there's just a single 1/16 diameter cable coming down through here, so I have plenty of room on either side of this piece. I've also rounded this off so it shouldn't catch, but I need to have that protrude a little bit to give me some extra width there to support the hole where the attachment bolt is going to go. Another option is to clamp this piece of metal in place and then just drill straight through this hole and through the metal. Or I can wait until the mast is glued together and then drill a hole straight through. Either one of those options will work. I don't have a center punch or transfer punch the right size for this hole, so I think I'm going to use that method. I'll just glue this in place and then I'll drill the hole after the mast blanks are glued together. Now I just need to shape the end here where the forestay attachment point will be. I need to be careful though how I shape this so that the forestay attachment point doesn't foul the jib halyard where it exits the sheave here on the front of the mast. I think that shape should work nicely. All right, that looks pretty good. Now we just need to drill the hole for the forestay. All right, that's a good fit, and then we'll be using these as our fittings, at least temporarily, for our rigging. So that's a good fit. That should work well for our forestay. I'm ready to glue these mast blanks together, but before I do that, I need to treat these internal channels with something to prevent rot in case any moisture gets down inside of the mast. To do that, I'm going to apply a coat of Total Boat penetrating epoxy. That's going to soak into the wood and then cure and prevent any rot or damage down the road. This penetrating epoxy goes together at a 2-to-1 mix, and then you can thin it further with solvents such as denatured alcohol. All right, now that's mixed, I'm going to add some denatured alcohol to thin it down a little bit more. Should have a nice water-like consistency so that this soaks into the wood fibers very well. All right, let's apply this to the mast. Penetrating epoxy is cured for a couple of days, so now we're going to take a sander and just sand these surfaces a little bit, get them nice and smooth, and that'll also make sure we get a good bond when we glue these two mast blanks together. With the light sanding complete, these two mast blanks are ready to glue together. Now the plans didn't provide any instructions on how to do that, but I'm planning on using some Total Boat epoxy. Our main concern when gluing these together is going to be preventing any squeeze out from interfering with these channels that we've routed into the mast. For the luff groove where the mainsail is going to go, I've gotten this silicone tubing and wiped it down with paste wax, and that's a perfect fit for this channel. Once the mast is glued together, we'll be able to pull this tubing out from the bottom of the mast, leaving our luff groove intact. As far as the channel for the halyards, on this mast we're going to be using 1/16 inch wire rope for our main halyard and jib halyard. So what I've done is I've gotten some 1/4-inch polyethylene tubing, and it's basically what you would use for plumbing an ice maker to a refrigerator. But this tubing is a perfect size to run that wire rope down, and it slides very freely with almost no friction. So the plan is to run this polyethylene tubing, 2 strands, one for the jib halyard and one for the main halyard, in the channel of the mast, and that'll prevent any squeeze out that gets into the mast from interfering with the halyards. We'll install the halyards into the tubing once the mast is complete. Now for most of my project, I've been using Totalboat 5:1 epoxy. But for the mast, Totalboat actually recommended and was nice enough to send me some of this Totalboat pre-thickened epoxy that you can apply with a gun. And that's what we're going to try on the mast, because we're going to be basically running 3 beads and then sandwiching these together. Well, that glue up was kind of tricky. I probably should have figured out a way to secure those small tubes down in the channels to keep them out of the way while epoxying the mast blanks together. But either way, I was able to get it done, and it's cured up overnight. So now I'm going to remove all the clamps and we can go on to forming the mast down to its final dimensions. After I removed all the clamps from the mast, I went ahead and cleaned up any squeeze out or bumps with a block plane. Then my wife helped me run the mast through my surface planer to bring it down to its final dimensions. It's now a 2 5/8 inch by 2 5/8 inch square. Before I can move on to making the mast round though, I need to cut the luff groove or bolt rope groove in the aft face of the mast. To do that, I've made this simple jig for my router. It consists of 2 pins that are just wide enough to clear the sides of the mast, and the router bit is centered perfectly between the pins. To use this jig, I set it over the mast and then twist it to bring the pins in contact with the sides of the mast. That centers the router bit perfectly over the center line of the mast. Then you just move the jig down the mast, being careful to keep the pins in contact with the sides of the mast, and that keeps the router bit centered. That takes care of routing the luff groove or bolt rope groove into the mast. Now we can go on to shaping it down to its final round diameter. To take the mast from its current square shape to round, we're going to make it an octagon first. And we're going to do that using the spar gauge that I made. Now there's a bunch of different instructions and templates for these online, so I'm not going to get too in-depth into it. But basically you have a block with 2 pins on it. These pins ride along the outside edges of the mast, much like our router jig that we used earlier. And then there's either 2 pins or pencils or some sort of marking or scribing point that's going to draw some lines on our mast. What we do is we run this gauge down each face of the mast, and it's going to make 2 lines. Then we run it down in the other face of the mast. Then what you do is you use a electric plane or hand plane to plane down and connect this line to this line on your corners. And when you do that, it's going to make it a perfect octagon. After it's an octagon, you can plane down the remaining corners to make it round. I took the mast from its square blank down to its round final shape using an electric plane as well as a hand plane. Once the mast was round, I used a curved card scraper to take off any other edges or corners and get it nice and perfect. After that, I hand sanded it down to a 220 grit finish. Now to finish the mast, I've applied 2 coats of Total Boat clear penetrating epoxy. This is going to soak into the wood and help seal the mast and give us a good base for our varnish coats later. While this epoxy cures, I'm going to go ahead and start making the attachment points for the side stays on the mast. And we're going to use the same aluminum that we used to make this 4-stay attachment point. This is the diagram for the tangs for the side stay attachment points. The plans call for 3/32 inch aluminum, brass, or stainless steel. I'm going to be using aluminum because that's what I was able to get. I was having difficulty finding stainless steel in the correct dimensions online, and I just didn't want to use brass. This is 3/4 inch stock, so the first thing I'm going to do is draw a center line. Now we're going to mark our holes. So we have the 2 important dimensions are 3 3/4 inch between these holes, and then 1 1/4 inch between these holes. I'm going to mark them with my center punch. I want to try to get these as close as possible so they match up with the holes that we pre-drilled in the mast. For the second part, I'm going to start at the opposite end and work my way down. There, that looks good. Now I can use this washer, which is the right dimensions, to draw the curves on the ends of these parts. This is 3/4 inch wide stock, so it's a 3/4 inch washer. Just center it on our punch mark and then trace it out. I'm going to drill the holes next because that way I have a nice piece of metal to hold on to give me good holding power. And then once we get the holes drilled, we'll cut the ends off and then sand them smooth. So here are our two tangs for attaching the side stays. I still need to deburr them, but then we'll go ahead and put this bend in them. And that's an 8-degree bend, so we'll do that using a vise and a protractor. That's pretty darn close. Right on the money. So here are the two completed tanks for attaching the side stays, and I think they're going to work really well. The two coats of penetrating epoxy on the mast have cured, so I'm going to sand it to a 220 grit finish, and then we can start applying our coats of varnish. After I finished sanding the entire spar to 220 grit, I wiped it down with some soapy water. I've let it dry thoroughly, and now I'm going to apply 3 coats of Total Boat Gleam 2.0 spar varnish. That spar varnish is going to give us good UV protection for the penetrating epoxy in the wood. It's also going to finish sealing the mast and give us a nice finish.
Here I'm applying the last coat of varnish to the mast. It turned out really nice, and I'm moving on to installing the hardware. This is the sheave at the top of the mast where the main halyard exits, and this is all stainless steel hardware, washers, bolts, and acorn nut, and 1/16 stainless steel wire cable. Bedding everything down with dolphinite just to prevent any water from getting in there and causing any problems, and then cleaning up the squeeze out and checking for freedom of movement. Now moving on to where the jib halyard exits the front of the mast. Again, same thing, stainless steel bolt, washers, and bedding everything down with dolphinite. And you can see there where I've attached the attachment points for the side stays. I got hit with a short notice move for work, and so I was trying to get the boat ready for launch before my move, and then I'm actually overseas for a year for work. But unfortunately I wasn't able to finish everything in time, so I'll have to finish the project when I get back. Here's at the bottom of the mast, installing the 2 sheaves where the main halyard and jib halyard exit the mast. Again, stainless steel hardware bedded down with dolphinite, and I'm using an ice pick to help align everything. I've got some washers inside there as spacers. And then cleaning up any squeeze out. I'm installing hardware on the halyards. These are just a little shackle, again stainless steel hardware, and I'm putting ends on the wire rope. Basically you put your little crimping sleeve on there, run it through the eyelet, and then crimp it tight. and then cut off the excess. This is pretty readily available hardware. I was able to get it all off Amazon. I have plenty of extra wire, so if I decide to change out hardware in the future, I can just cut these and then make new lines with whatever hardware I decide to use. And with the plastic tubing down the channels inside the mast, new lines are really easy to run. So again, here I'm adding another end on one of the cables to the little shackle. And there I'm just checking for freedom of movement, making sure nothing's tangled up. And so those are the two completed halyards. Just trimming off the last little bit of excess. Now I'm moving on to installing the winch system for the halyards. There's a bunch of different designs that people have made up for this for wooden snipes, but I found the easiest thing to do was to use a winch system off a Flying Scot. I was able to find this on eBay, and then I just had to bend those flanges a little bit to get it to fit to my mast. This saved me a lot of time, preventing me from having to come up with my own winch system. And so here it just screws right onto the mast. So I'd left the halyards a little long so I'd have plenty of extra cable to connect these to the halyards. So now I'm feeding it down through the pulley, pushing the end through, and then I'll crimp the end so that it doesn't pull out of the crank. With the end secured, I can just wind it up and check and make sure everything operates freely. And now I'm just installing the final halyard. These Flying Scot winches, you can find a lot of replacement parts to rebuild them, but I was actually having trouble finding one that was new. This one was used, but it seems to be in good shape. So with the winch installation complete, that finishes the mast project. And due to my rush to get the house moved and get everything settled before I went overseas, I wasn't able to get much more video. But here's the winch installed with some bungees keeping the halyards from getting tangled. And then I did complete the mast step and get the mast step installed on the boat, but unfortunately I didn't get any video of that. But here's a picture of the mast stepped in its final position and rigging. I've got a bunch of still shots, so I'm hoping to build a video of some of that process and post it. But otherwise, I'll just have to wait till I get back stateside, and then I'll do a walk around of the boat showing all the rigging that I installed, and hopefully we'll have the big launch video. Thank you all for watching, and hope to see you soon.